Wake up, everybody. It's time for the History You Forgot podcast, the podcast where three veteran teachers with over 90 years now of teaching experience catch you up on the stuff that you slept through. And today, we're looking at economic issues between World War I and World War II, commonly known as the Great Depression. Here it comes.
I'm Jason Jones.
I'm Jeff Breedlove.
And I'm Jason Schmoida. And we're talking about some depression stuff today, fellas. Good stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. But not feeling depressed myself.
Not depressed.
So we're filming this on a Friday.
We got some bee's knees with us,
Some
right?
bee's knees.
Got some bee's knees. So today, the drink of the day is bee's knees. And bee's knees is gin, 2 to 3 ounces of gin, 3/4 or so ounce of honey syrup, which is simple syrup made with honey instead of sugar, and then lemon juice. And it's garnished with a lemon, and there's some history to it, which is kind of fun too.
Well, yeah, bee's knees is a slang term from the 1920s here in the United States, and it just really means excellence. And so hopefully the drink is excellent, right? But if you ever have some spare time when you're sitting around your house and you want to Google fun, like something fun, look up 20s slang. There is all sorts of great 1920s.
So like somebody would be the bee's knees.
Yeah, you would be the bee's knees. This would be, your product. Yes, for sure.
Right.
To the podcast.
To episode 10.
10, I believe.
Nice. I could do that.
Well,
Yeah. It's,
not-
and I'm not a gin guy.
I'm
but
not either.
It doesn't taste ginny to me. I mean,
Doesn't smell like a pine
It's
tree.
also good gin. I mean, we did put
that
some,
is true.
we didn't do the bathtub gin. Keep it in the spirit of the
Right.
Scooping it.
Yeah, that would have been fun.
I guess keep with the theme.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start with the context or the background, right? So if you remember the last episode, we had the end of World War I. You're going to have the Treaty of Versailles, France, and you're going to have Britain and France and Russia and the United States sitting around a table with some people really angry, right? I mean, France and Britain really want to punish Germany.
They should have had some bee's knees.
Or they should have relaxed a little bit before they went in there, right? But
Germany
they really
was not the bee's knees.
no. And so they really want to punish Germany. And Germany is going through, obviously, a terrible economic time just because of a failed war. But then they have a new government, and in my best German accent, the Weimar Republic, right, is going to be a new democratic government. So they're coming out of hundreds and hundreds of years of having somebody tell them what to do. And now they're trying to compete in the markets and sell goods and services and those kinds of things. So they're really going to struggle with that, along with all of the things that are hampering them from the Treaty of Versailles. War reparations. There's something called the War Guilt Clause, which Germany has to admit that they are the problem and why the war started. And they have to pay back the Allied countries for the damages they had done, or at least they're being blamed for. Obviously, everybody was at fault to some extent, right? And so you've got war reparations that, and Jeff will talk about this here in a minute, that they really default on within the first year, right? You've got a military that is, capped at 100,000 men. They lose territory in various places in the world, like Africa and other colonies. They just are going to really struggle. And the Weimar Republic is going to be around from the end of that war, 1919-ish, to early 1930s, as they try to rule in a democratic fashion. And it's just really hard for them.
Yeah, and I think you have to remember, too, that, it seems like we keep harping on Germany. And even though we're going to be talking about the Great Depression, that's not Germany's fault, right? But we're going to kind of lead into is just that the misconception of the 20s as being all good, right? The Roaring 20s and Prohibition and all that, stereotypical stuff, that it starts off really rough.
Well, and especially in our country, the United States, in my opinion, we sensationalized the 20s, right? I mean, Al Capone and the mob and the Roaring 20s and the flappers and
But I think 100%. And I think that when we get to the Great Depression, it's a decade of economic chaos, right? I mean, so it's not like we're going to go one cause, there's multiple. But I think remember what Germany is. It is all countries are going to struggle with the end of the war. Right, because they've all, especially European countries, because they've been destroyed. Their infrastructure is gone. So to rebuild that, that's going to take lots of economic strength, right, stability. But for Germany, they are saddled with not only the typical war, but now costs of war, but the reparations, which I've seen all sorts of disparate figures, but you look at about $500 billion in today's money that they have to pay back on top of it, right, which goes to your payback, right? That Great Britain and France. And so, they are going to immediately default on that payment. I think they make one, right? And then they don't make another one.
Well, and one other thing that I forgot to throw in there is the demilitarized zone between Germany and France. And, that area is a very industrial area for France or for Germany. For Germany. Yep.
But I think you have to remember too, all right, they've lost, a huge segment of their land. They've had their colonies taken away, so they lack resources now that they had for industrialization. The blockade of Germany, right, has stopped their sort of supply chain, right, getting in and out. So, they are saddled with all of this, and this war debt's just going to make it worse. So after they default on their first payment, they make the first payment and then default, it triggers from the Treaty of Versailles, France is going to reclaim this Ruhr Valley, like the Rhineland, which is this economic powerhouse for Germany. And if they default, that's what France gets. So it again hampers, right? So now Germany's even hampered again because they've lost their industrial zone. So, in a way, what they do, which is never, ever, ever what you do in an economic situation, is to make those factories and the production of them less valuable to hurt the French. The Germans then basically devalue the mark, and they do it by just printing billions and billions and billions of Deutschmarks or Reichsmarks that just send their dollar into the absolute pits of economic. They call it hyperinflation, right? But
in the Weimar Republic, though, Jeff, didn't they think they were helping the people of the Rhine River Valley? So they didn't have to work, and
because they've told people they're living that don't go to the factories, right? We're going to hurt the French, so we do that by having to then give them salaries, right? And so you're printing all this money, and whenever you ever have a situation, never ever print money, right? It just creates inflation, right? More money. Was it more money, more problems?
That's right.
So the hyperinflation gets so bad, right, that at one point, the mark is tripling like in a day, right? You have to have 3 times as many mark in the afternoon than you do in the morning, right, to buy the same loaf of bread. And you probably have seen all those, pictures in this books of, people wheeling wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. People are getting paid twice a day. What's some other ones?
Burning marks to start fires.
Right, because wood is more expensive than the value of the paper.
Kids playing with marks.
That's right. Those big bundles. People wallpapering with it because scrap paper is worthless, which then makes the situation for Germany worse, right? So in the 1920s, that's what starts it off. I mean, that whole economic chaos. Now, it will level out, right? Germany will eventually begin to pick it up a little bit. And so will France and Germany, right? Their economies, but they're going to have to learn economically, right? Not to belabor the point, but the governments have typically dealt with this, what they call classic liberalism, right? Which is government involvement, right? I mean, in the sense that the government creates like monopolies and they set protectionist kind of situations. And then it's like, just let it go, but not in laissez-faire. And the problem is in international trade, that doesn't work anymore, right? The governments have to actually create situations. They have to fund industry. They have to build infrastructure, right? And so that new sort of shift towards capitalism is going to be a little tough.
Very, very much. And just laissez-faire, just to make sure everybody remembers, that means hands-off government. Right, hands off business, and
unregulated.
And that's not what they're used to,
right?
And really, in most countries in Europe, they're used to the hands-on.
And so I think what's going to help Germany bounce back is what we're going to, you're going to talk about here is that America steps up, right, with funding.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah. So quick recap from the last episode. At the end of the war, there was a period, although it was fairly short, it was pretty serious, of recession after the war.
in the U.S.
In the U.S.
Yeah.
Sorry, speaking for us, we didn't bounce right away, but we would by 1923. By 1923, the U.S. economy was really pretty much rolling. They had figured out how to take the pre-war industries that had been developed, turn them into war industries, and then turn the war industries back into consumer goods. And the consumer economy of the United States in the 20s really took off. And it was with that sort of wealth and that new innovation and new ingenuity, the United States was kind of flush. We weren't rebuilding right after the war.
Yeah, our infrastructure was good.
That's huge.
We talked in the last episode also about that revolving war debt, and we sort of entered into the fray there. We signed a separate peace treaty with Germany because we didn't enter into the Treaty of Versailles and didn't enter into the League of Nations. And part of that treaty was we will loan Germany money. So the United States was loaning Germany money. Germany was using a lot of that money, a significant amount of that money, to pay off their war debts, which is what you guys are talking about, a ridiculous amount of money that they were never going to be able to pay off. And that in turn went to the European powers who were paying off the debts that they had accrued from us during World War I. And it was just this cycle of we really were the ones not paying ourselves back as much as anything, and kind of never
charge interest as it goes around the circle, right?
Yeah, kind of a ridiculous situation.
Right, Mr. Shmoyda, too, with just to kind of make sure people are tracking. Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson, wrote the 14 points. The League of Nations was a part of that.
Yeah.
And our Congress in the United States wouldn't allow us to be part of it.
Right.
And so it's like the United Nations today.
A little bit. Sort of. It was the precursor to the United Nations, really. And we could get into the reasons why that ultimately boiled down to this, which I think does play a little bit into what we say here. The United States was moving towards pretty serious isolation, protectionism. We were trying to raise tariffs and trying to stay away from the world. And part of the treaty required in the League of Nations that you come to each other's rescue for war. And Congress wanted to retain the right to declare war. And so they rejected that. And that pretty much tanked the treaty.
Pre-World War I isolationism. Going back to that.
Oh,
right?
Yeah. I mean,
because it happened, right? Because, clearly after the war, America sort of stepped into that void, right? Financially, especially. But I think, you have to remember that America benefits if the rest of the world has money, because when everybody else's infrastructure has been destroyed, as our industries that are going to make all the goods that the people in the other parts are going to buy. Yeah. So it makes sense for the U.S. to loan the money to European countries to rebuild so that they then can keep. So it's like a double. We're paying interest on the loan and they're buying American products. It's a win for the U.S. economically. So what you have to remember, right, as the economics thing here is that the U.S. bounces, even though the Dawes plan, right, isn't necessarily great, the European countries begin to bounce back. Their economic policies take hold. The roaring 20s and the sort of boom economically, right, it kicks in. And then you have this sort of, I call it a veneer, right? There's this underlying economic crisis that's just waiting to happen, which is, after a few years, right, is what we're going to talk about, right, with the sort of 1929, all of a sudden it just collapses, but it's been coming for a while.
Yeah.
Right. So
it's boom to bust. And the reasons for it are plenty. There's not one thing that led to it. I know commonly a misconception of sometimes in the United States is that the stock market crash caused the Depression. Right. And while it was certainly a contributor to it, stock market crash really was that first real sign of illness.
Yeah, I always teach it as it's like the catalyst, right? It's the everything has been brewing, and then this happens, and it pops up all the other problems that exist. But I think you have to remember too that this is the 1920s, right? So the idea of mechanization and industrialization is still, weekly is sort of technology is making things cheaper to produce, faster to produce, cheaper to buy, right? It's a consumer culture. And those industries, right, movies and cars and oil, right? These new industries are now on the scene.
And they're affordable.
Right? Prices are down, so everybody's buying them, which also puts this veneer, right, that consumer culture means that, everyone's better than they were in terms of quality of life.
And that's even goes along with the stock market. I mean,
Oh,
people
100%.
people thought they had the money, and then they were buying stocks on layaway almost, right? They were
Speculation.
borrowing.
Yeah.
They were borrowing money and paying minimal into it, and that's going to help lead to that crash.
100%.
Yeah.
Not to mention that we've got a little bit of a list, and it does get really hard to keep it organized. Farmers were doing the same thing.
Yep.
Farmers were overproducing. Mechanization hit farmers. The corporate model it hit farming. All of that was in play. In fact, farmers will probably feel this before everybody else did.
Wouldn't you guys agree, though, even with the Dawes Plan and even the money that other countries are pumping into some of those European powers that are decimated, it still wasn't enough to keep up with buying the products and the grains and the different things that we were producing and other people were producing. So a lot of that wasn't being sold. Maybe.
Yeah, and the economic policy, right, is, Herbert Hoover, right, by the end of the 20s is now kind of in office, right? This typical sort of conservative Republican, economically speaking.
Traditional.
Right. So I think that
laissez-faire.
Absolutely.
Right. And so the problem becomes when you talk about this new era, right? Economics is pretty simple, right? So production is up, which means prices go down.
Right.
Well, now that prices go down, even though people are buying it, revenues for industry falls because they're just selling products, but for a lot cheaper. And I always use, the analogy about when I was in high school, a VCR cost $1,000, right?
And
now you can
VC what?
A Betamax, right? But then all of a sudden, right now you go to Walmart and you can buy 5 for $100, right? They hand them out like candy, that's what's happening. So revenues are down for industry, which means they're laying off people across the board. So that's also, and if people get laid off, they have less money to spend. So there's this cycle, right? This is that underlying, and farmers have been borrowing money to buy mechanical equipment,
land.
I mean, everything is cheap, and that's good, but it isn't as well, right? So,
well, it's good. It's good if there's still the right level of demand.
Right.
If there's not the right level of demand, it doesn't work out.
Right. So talk about then, I guess, the speculation piece. I mean, if you
is with regard to the United States on the stock market, that was, you kind of hinted at people were excited to get involved in, and it became, and I always kind of call it like the casino effect. There was an opportunity to make money on the stock market. It was the trendy thing to do, and everybody wanted in on it. And the people that really knew what they were doing could take advantage of that. And they could guide people to the stocks they wanted to guide them to, and they could buy low, sell high. They could make money on it. If the average person made money on it here and there, great. But otherwise, it was kind of like a slot machine for a while where anybody and everybody was getting involved trying to make their money on the stock market.
Early in the 20s and right after the war, they were successful, right?
The market
were
is
making money.
Oh, yeah, the market has routinely shown that it's a good investment.
Yeah. 23, well into 28, 29.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It was doing really well. It was masked, though. The success was masked a little bit. It was maybe not as good as it seemed. There were practices like, first starting with the speculation, when people go in and out of stocks, that creates a little confidence issue. And as you guys probably know better than I do, and you could probably explain better than I could, even confidence issue, right? Confidence is so important in the stock market.
Absolutely.
And when prices are going up and down, when people are buying and selling a lot, you kind of lose confidence. And that's one thing. But then you also had companies misreporting.
There's no regulation of business.
There's not much there.
Or the market.
Stock watering, I think, is one thing they called it, where they would report that they were worth more than they were, or they would drop, what we would call insider trading, tips to the public to say, hey, this might be coming, and it wasn't. And so they were doing things to maybe inflate their wealth and their worth more than it was. So when you start figuring all that stuff out, and you realize there's a little screwiness going on, and people are going to pay
100%. But I think also, even though the minority of people in the U.S. are able to buy stock, they're doing it. The speculation piece is they're borrowing money to buy stocks.
Right.
So they would go to a bank or a broker, and the brokers, because the market has been up, it's making money. They will loan you, 10%. So you could control, $1 million worth of stock for $100,000 that the firm is going to loan you in the first place.
Right.
So the assumption is, clearly the stock market's going to go up. You'll sell it. They'll get their interest back. They'll get their money. And that's going to also then, this lack of regulation in that regard. People are I guess they're over leveraged.
Right. And then when the confidence goes down and people start to sell, people get nervous, and the brokers get nervous. And then they're going back to the buyers and saying, hey, we want our money. We need our money.
Well,
it's not there.
And to make it even worse, then, if you go to your bank, the banks had invested in the stock market as well.
And in land and housing and stuff.
And the banks eventually just kind of shut their doors, didn't they? Didn't let people in.
Once everything crashes, the first real obvious effect of it, I think, was the banks closures.
Right. And that speaks, I think, then to the point of that consumer confidence, right? Even if it's a small, 5 banks, right, that end up closing their doors, or for the day, they don't have the cash. I mean, you've all seen It's a Wonderful Life, right? So you know what a bank run is. But if 5 banks shut their doors, even in the day and age of the 20s, it spread like wildfire.
Right. Well, back then there were so many banks.
I mean, you have telephones and things like that. So mass communication. So everybody hears, a bank in Kansas City closed or shut their doors. And then there's a run on every bank because now people assume, well, if it's one.
Well, and our grandparents grew up in that time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and during the Depression. And so, these are the folks that plastered up a coffee, can in the wall with their cash in it, right? Or in the mattress.
Yeah.
You're right.
Well, yeah, I mean, little anecdote, right? My grandmother, who passed away, I don't know, 13, 14 years ago, was 102, right? When she passed, 103, and never left a restaurant without half of her meal wrapped in a napkin. And she would have what she called a pocketbook, right? A purse full of, sugar packets and salt packets, because you never know, right? When another depression is going to pop up and you now have to live on. Right. But it is a psychological scar, without a doubt.
Yeah. And not to go too far down that rabbit hole,
but a good one,
when my grandparents passed, I remember going into their basement, which was unfinished, and they literally had stacks of newspapers from the floor to the ceiling, just in case they needed it to start fires or anything like that. My grandmother kept the styrofoam, like that you got pork chops or ground beef on, and that was where the leftovers went. Right. And she had stacks and stacks. So it's amazing, that mentality.
Yeah. And the market, those are the stories that everybody has, those stories, but they're real.
Oh,
I mean,
sure.
People talk about that, but it's a trauma, right? A national trauma. But the market crashing, the word is, yes, it clearly drops on the Thursday, right? So there's that, bad Thursday or whatever they call it. And then
multiple crash days.
Yeah. So they're like days, and it drops a lot. And then again, this confidence drops, and now people are like worried about the market. So the stock market works on basic supply and demand. So if people are worried about the stock market going down, they sell their stock. Right. So now I'm selling my stock. It's good if I'm the first person to sell, or the fifth person, because I sell at the high price. I can pay back my leverage, right? The bank gets their money back. But all of a sudden, when you put more stock in the market, the price drops.
Right.
So now everybody starts to sell their stock. The price of the stock drops. So now a lot of people are underwater.
Right.
They have the loan, but the market doesn't reflect the gains.
Right.
And that's the Black Friday, right? When, you hear about.
Which is ironic that it's Black Friday and what we think of Black Friday today.
Because it gets you out of the red and into
the black. Right.
These were dark days.
Yeah. Similarly, a different time.
And if we can put all that together just to make sure that we make sense of it all, we're talking about causes of the Depression. The market was a cause, but it also was a symptom, right? And it was kind of that culminating piece. But everything that we were kind of trying to discuss, from overproduction to mechanization to issues with consumer goods and farmers being overproduced, especially that part of it, but uneven distribution of wealth. There was an amazing separation between the wealthy and the poor. Even middle class at that point was sort of disappearing. The stage was set for a lot of bad things to happen, and I think Europe was in a similar situation as well.
Well, and Europe was the market, right, for the American goods, and so the market was weak in terms of where Americans sell.
100%. And the economy, when the U.S. economy drops, and all of a sudden banks start pulling their money in, those are the banks that have lent the Europeans the money to rebuild. If the banks are calling in their loans or stop loaning money, all of these national economies, European, some Asian, that were relying on that funding, the money's gone, right? And so it trickled down in a negative, sense of term, like everything then just, beep rolls downhill, right? So I think that's what that all like the effect of everything.
Yeah. So let's look at what that shift in the economy did in terms of an effect on people.
Sure.
If you don't mind, if I'd start the U.S., we had been for years now, since from the Civil War until this point, there had only been two Democratic presidents, Cleveland and Wilson. So it was very dominated by Republican, very dominated by that laissez-faire, hands-on, business be business and all that. And it leaves us, as the Great Depression begins, with Hoover, who was one of them. But Hoover also talked a little bit about, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, but he also talked about there's a place for government. He actually served in World War I under Wilson as the Food Administration guy. So a lot of Republicans said, hey, you were working for the Democrat during the war. And he said, hey, during emergencies, I think there's a place for government, which would hint that maybe Hoover would do something more about it. And while he sort of did, right, he got out of that box a little bit and he began to sort of deficit spend. He raised taxes at one point, tried to cut taxes at another point. Actually, reverse. He had cut taxes early on, tried to raise
them later.
And not only during the Depression, but in an election year, which is even worse. But it would usher in a massive change in the United States from the traditional sort of politics of Andrew Mellon as Treasury Secretary during the 1920s, saying, let's make the rich richer, let's cut taxes on the wealthy, and let's let that wealth trickle down to jobs and production, to what John Maynard Keynes would call prime in the pump.
There we go.
Which would be, we need to insert the government into the economy where it needs it most and push from the bottom up and build that. We called it, we wanted to have that purchasing power, right?
Right. Deficit spending.
Power. Deficit spending. We want to create purchasing power.
This demand creates supply.
Yeah. And he said, I'm trying to remember his words. The government becomes the spender of last resort. That's what it was. The spender of last resort. And so it'll usher in Franklin Roosevelt and the alphabet agencies, right? The first and second New Deal, where we will really spin into what becomes kind of the modern, more progressive or liberal thinking about what government's role in the economy is.
Right.
With the first New Deal, second New Deal, both of them injecting a lot of government, creating relief, which was meant to help the people that needed it most immediately. Recovery, which was meant to build industries for the future. And then, of course, reforms, which is going to create changes in how we did all this stuff that maybe addresses the causes.
And so relief things like Social Security Administration, unemployment insurance. I mean, those kind of things are what they're...
It really started with, relief was kind of goal number one because you want to take care of the people that needed it the most. So he closed all the banks.
Bank holiday, right?
The bank holiday. A lot of that relief stuff was early on, closing the banks, giving money to the states that needed it the most. For things like whether it's food kitchens or housing or whatever it was. The second New Deal, once we get past that first 100 days into the second phase of this, which is really because he wasn't sure what he was doing. He was listening.
This is Roosevelt.
Roosevelt was very unsure what he was doing. He's listening to Keynes, but he didn't want to go too far because Keynes' ideas seemed really radical for that time. So the first New Deal came and went. It was literally creating jobs for the sake of jobs, like the CCC, the civilian job. What is it called?
Civilian Conservation Corps.
NRA, National Relief Act, which was
Tennessee Valley.
Yes. A lot of the dams and things that have been
concrete, a lot of concrete.
Literally, jobs for the sake of jobs. Let's just get these young men off the road.
They pay them a wage.
Can I butt in here real quick? Yeah. Because the same thing was happening in Germany. Right.
Yeah,
Hitler
absolutely.
was creating all of these organizations that were providing jobs for people that were down and out, including, rebuilding infrastructure and those kinds of things. So there's
and the irony, I love that, is a great point, is that because they were unable to militarize, technically, you would have these, you got to Google this, they would have these great, films where you couldn't be militarizing, so you would have 100,000 boys with shovels.
On their shoulder.
On their shoulder doing military exercises, and they were all just good farmers, right? But you were clearly training them.
There's an old PBS Frontline maybe called The Democrat and the Dictator.
Oh, really?
And it paralleled because Hitler and Roosevelt came to power the same year. They instituted a revamped role for government. They weren't the same, but they, similar involvement, and they pulled us out of the Depression. But, one of the criticisms in the United States for a while there was that Germany was moving faster towards success than we were.
Right.
Oh, absolutely.
And it was, it's the difference between democratic figure, of course.
Well, and I think it also comes down to the fact that, I mean, geography, right? I mean, as Germany rebuilds, right, they've got all that sort of infrastructure that now has been rebuilt with those dollars. They have France on their border. They have Soviet Union. I mean, so they're closer, right? So a lot of that is sort of built on that. And I think the thing about Keynes that makes it so different is that deficit spending isn't, but you would always offset deficit spending with increased taxes
Later,
once
right? The government,
right. So, but what Keynes is basically telling you is put money in the hands of the consumer, right? You know, a check, literally a check. And we're not going to raise taxes, right? We're going to just deficit spend, and it will work out when the economy grows. Industrial revenue will grow, taxes will grow, people will have
which is always harder to do. That's the harder part to do. When the economy's good, to go to people and say, okay, we're going to recover our losses so that our deficit's not so bad, we're going to raise taxes.
Right. And nobody
wants to do that. Nobody politically is going to come out.
100%. I used to tell kids they both work.
Right.
One just works slower than the others.
Yeah. And if you think about the difference between the ideologies between the two countries, obviously the United States, you're not being forced, right? In Germany, if you weren't pulling, you weren't rowing the boat, you might be under the boat.
It's mostly true with the New Deal, although it was really pushed.
Sure, but
it wasn't like universally popular.
No, and Roosevelt wasn't universally popular.
No.
Right. I mean, he took a hit.
But by today's standards, I would think he's still very popular.
Like, what, 50%?
Yeah, if you run at 50 to 1%,
right,
you're doing
pretty good.
You're doing well.
Yeah, you're pretty well liked.
Well, and to bring it kind of regional, I mean, a lot of stuff here in Kansas City, right? The infrastructure, the courthouse and the paving of Brush Creek with concrete. I mean, a lot of that is sort of that, even though it's a little bit machine politics, it's also putting people to work. All the Thomas Hart Benton murals, right? You put artists to, you build schools, you dig ditches, right? All that stuff, right? So,
what's the arena downtown? Wasn't that a
New
Deal era?
Not the music hall, the
municipal.
That's it. Right. Well, that's why everything is concrete, right? Because somebody controlled the concrete, but then put people to work. Right. So it's a good thing.
Yeah, you're still in the machine politics era. We'll have to talk about that.
That's a whole nother good story.
Yeah. But so the only thing I'd say to kind of conclude the United States pivot is that that's a big one, to pivot to this type of government. That reform piece that sort of comes in the later part of the New Deal is important, because that's really going to change banking. It's going to change the stock market. It's going to change a lot of those fundamental.
That's what I wanted to ask you is this is when the FDIC came about.
Yeah.
So
FDIC was in the first New Deal. It's part of the Glass-Steagall Act, actually.
Okay.
And it was important for restoring confidence in banks, obviously. But then there was some more hefty regulation of banks in the second, which is where I'm getting at. There's a little bit more of a push towards we're going to fix the problem. And it's government getting involved in areas where they hadn't been involved before, like the stock market and banking.
Forever.
Financing.
Right. Ever.
Yeah.
Which I think goes to that whole, adage you've heard, right? The best way to fix a bad economy, right, is a good war. Well, it works if everybody's economy is underperforming. Right. So the 1920s, right, or 30s. So what happens is, right, all these economies are underperforming. Well, when you switch from a consumer culture to a militarized, like, people go back to work even more, right? I mean, it kind of spurs that. But I think we were going to talk about, the U.S. is really important, but it's probably worst felt in Germany, I would guess. I mean, absolutely. We're talking by 1932, 33% unemployment, whereas what the U.S. probably maxes out at
30-ish.
Okay, so pretty parallel. Great Britain, France, some of those not nearly as high. Right, a lot of those governments have already kind of converted to this idea of involvement by the, like, there's already unemployment insurance in some of these countries. There's already, workers help.
You've got democratic governments or parliamentary governments in England and in France.
Right.
You've got, you're right. Countries that are already used to trying to support citizens.
Right. Which is huge, because then they're able to step in. Plus their populations are less. Yeah. Right. So, they're able to kind of step in a little quicker.
And you mentioned geography. I think in terms of building infrastructure and rebuilding infrastructure, I think all of that is a lot easier in Europe than in the United States, just because of the sheer size.
Yeah. And we'd never done that.
Right.
It was all brand new.
Yeah.
The whole idea.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that, the thing that me and Joji can talk about, but when 1932, which triggers not only Roosevelt, but the effect of the Great Depression on Germany especially, but lots of these countries, is the rise of sort of nationalist, more of that sort of fringy element because of the unemployment rate.
Absolutely. So remember, we've got a guy down in Italy who's
He's been in power now for about 10 years.
Yeah, Mussolini's been in power for about 10 years. He's the first fascist. When you hear that term, everybody thinks Hitler, but Hitler learned a lot from Mussolini. Hitler learned the fiery speech from the balcony from Mussolini. He learned a
lot of the Roman rhetoric.
Oh yeah,
Nazi Germany.
Absolutely, and that's another good point. The Roman Empire, the Germans called the First Reich.
Yeah,
and then when they unified in the 1870s. Under Otto von Bismarck, it was the Second Reich, and then Hitler's Germany's the Third Reich, and Hitler wants to make the Mediterranean Sea a German lake, right? It's like the Romans had.
It's a great way to put it.
Yeah. But so Hitler's learning these things from Mussolini, who was placed in power legally,
right? Which I just cut an ad about. Pay attention.
Yeah, and now Hitler is going to come to power legally but both of them are thorns in the sides of the government, and they're kind of put in power or helped into power because they think they can control them.
Well, yeah, and they're corporate economic systems, right? So you incent big business to create. These big businesses hire people, put people back to work.
Right.
Those people back to work now have money, they can buy stuff, right? So the corporate, the rich industrialists were in favor of this economic policy.
Absolutely.
Right. And so it worked in Italy, right? I mean, there's lots of evidence that Mussolini in the 1920s does bring Italy back economically. And so
survived
much easier than anybody else.
Well, and Hitler's promising all the things that the people want to hear. He's promising the jobs.
Right.
He's promising to put money back in their bank account. He's promising to not follow the Treaty of Versailles and remilitarize Germany and make Germany a power again. And before World War I think it's really important to remember that Germany was second or third or maybe even first in terms of industrial power. They had caught up with Great Britain, and it was the British, the Americans, and the Germans that were really economically the strongest countries in the world.
Yeah, and so I think that clearly you can tie the rise of these authoritarian governments to. I mean, literally, you just look at the sort of electoral popularity, right? Of, by 1932, right? All of a sudden, bam, you've got this overwhelming number of Germans who are voting, and the Nazis do gain power because their message is very simple.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's that connection between last episode and this episode.
Right. Absolutely. But I mean, you have to remember too.
Flow together.
Yeah, you can speak to it. I mean, in the US, there's also a very active far right, nationalist.
We mentioned that in the last episode, I think, but there were Communist Party, there was a Nazi Party in the United States.
It gives rise to the fringe elements, right?
Absolutely.
And I think you need to think about so the other connection as we move on, right? Is so Germany clearly has moved towards an authoritarian as a result. Japan isn't hurt as badly as others because they're already kind of isolated, right? But they do, right? Remember, Japan is a very militarized society to begin with. So it does give power to these sort of ultranational military-based politicians. The prime minister is assassinated, right? And that military government sort of takes hold, and they begin expanding, looking for resources by 1937 in China and Southeast Asia.
Well, then Russia is now the Soviet Union, right? Remember, they dropped out of World War I during the war, and which was a huge fear to the British and the French because of the two-front war. And Russia historically has been, I'm going to go 100+ years behind the rest of Europe in industrialization, militarization, just everything. They still had a czar when they got out of the war,
for a very short time.
Right. And now they're communists, or at least they're claiming a communist government. And Lenin is around, and then he's going to be gone. And Stalin is there, and so I would say, and correct me here, Jeff, if I'm wrong, but I would say the Depression affected them, but they were so far behind it, maybe let them catch up.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And I think the communist ideology also is much more reliant, right? I mean, they're not necessarily, like you said, big on international trade yet. Right? Nobody's really sure of how communism looks. Nobody's really trusts communism. There's not much international trade, so they're relying on their own internal resources and people. And
well, remember too, their economy, it's controlled by the government. Right, it's collective farms, and everything is grown goes back to the state and then it's distributed and those kinds of things. So,
but I mean, it's the 30s under Stalin, right? But the 5-year plans,
right,
where you end up with heavy industry and Stalin's, forced industrialization and urbanization, right? So in 20-year period, by World War II, for sure, the Soviet Union has caught up industrially, so within
reason,
striking distance, right? So, for some of these countries, it did not have the same effect as in Germany and the US. They were able to come out of it, but it still felt. I mean, it's still. I always tell there's. I don't know if you can name a person on the planet who isn't at least somehow impacted by the economics of the 1920s, right? Good or bad,
right?
Yeah,
clearly,
right. Yeah. So I don't know.
And this of course is going to, since we started this with it's between the wars, this is going to be one of the things that's leading us into World War II as an issue. But there's many more that we'll talk about later. But
so I assume we're going to do the chronology. We're just going to kind of roll into World War II.
We might as well.
It would make sense for us to
might as well
throw together, tie up all these things and put them into causes.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea.
Yeah.
So, well, hopefully we kind of cleared some things up a little bit about economics, Great Depression. I think
this could have been another episode.
It could have been
2, 3. We could just go on.
It could have been,
which is clearly our problem.
Well, and when there's your pocketbooks hurt, right? Everybody sits up a little straighter.
That's what people want to know about it.
They do.
I would hope.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for watching.
Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. Who are we having a drink?
Oh, well,
so breathe love. I'm sorry.
So I'll do it.
You know what we need? Real fast before we need to get somebody on staff,
right,
to
and we've got lots of money to pay.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, huge amount of cash pile. Which also I guess we could use a sponsor. But we need someone to bring us, this is clearly an issue.
Yeah.
That's my point. Right? We need to be able to ring a bell and have ding.
That would be
so who is it, James?
Well, so I probably have not told the people who watch, but I'm from Iowa.
Yeah.
Right. Herbert Hoover is the only president from the state of Iowa. And Herbert Hoover was a staunch Republican, laissez-faire policies. And I think it would be fascinating to sit down with him be a fly on the wall in the Oval Office, right? As all this is happening, and how do you positively affect it? How do you keep it from continuing? I just think it'd be fascinating
and he struggled.
Yeah, he struggled. He struggled early because he tried to keep his hands off, and then he tried to put his hands in the pot and didn't really know how to do that either.
And got really bitter about the way people treated him.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he's gone down as sort of there's a negative connotation to, when you hear Herbert Hoover, but is it earned?
Yeah, that's a great question.
That's a tough question. Right?
Yeah. I mean, and you're the economic guy, but I would always argue that, I would argue that most presidents, we hear a lot about inheriting things today, right? And there is a little bit of inheritance, right? There's you can still do things as a president to positively or negatively affect the inheritance, but
no, you're right.
Keep in mind, he was elected to keep his hands off and keep the ball rolling.
Right.
Like 1928.
And had to make that stuff up as he needed to.
But nobody knew what to do.
Nobody knew what to do. That's the key. That's the key thing. Nobody knew what to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know. So it's interesting. I mean, I think we'll come back probably, I'm sure, to economics again at some point, right? I mean,
it's a
cyclical
war too. So
yeah, I mean, it's everything. They've talked about it a lot. So,
well,
I don't want to end early, but
I think it's probably time to say class dismissed.
All right. Thanks for watching. Don't forget,
follow and like us.
Subscribe, do all that stuff, and tell somebody else about it. Please. I know you guys love it. So,
I'm ringing the bell now.
Another thing we need, a bell.